Welcome to the MasterMind Library. They call me Ferdinand, the bringer of balance, leader of many disciplines, and one of your hosts of the MasterMind Library, the home of the MasterMind Book Club on FHTII.com. Today, we are in episode 119. We got a new book, right? The story of my life and work, Booker T's own life story. And we're missing our co-host. He's right here asleep right now. But we've got in our live audience, we've got Huey, Sincere, and Elijah over there eating some brownies. And they're going to be listening in. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in to our book. I'm very excited for this book. This book right here, matter of fact, let me grab it real quick. So not only am I sitting in my grandmother's chair, and for all of the episodes of the MasterMind Library, I've sat in my grandmother's chair, so I'm bringing in the energy of my grandmother every time, right? Mama Ann, okay, and Mama Ann, she gifted me this book, right? This is I believe it's a 1901. My son, he did some things. It's kind of got a few of the pages in a tizzy, but looking for the copyright date if I can find it. But I do believe that this is a 1901 original of Booker T. Washington's own story of his life and work. Right, powerful material. We're going to read this today. Today we're going to go through the intro, and we're going to go through chapter 1. Right, powerful material. Right, Tuskegee University. The bricks, the original bricks, the students. They made the original bricks of Tuskegee University. The students built the school. The students built Tuskegee University, literally, right? And it's all detailed in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, let's get to our introduction. There we go. Let's make it a little bit larger. And let's make it a little larger on the screen for everybody. And we're going to dive on in. I have cheerfully consented to prefix a few words introductory to this autobiography. While I have encouraged its publication, not a sentence has been submitted has been submitted to my examination. From my intimate acquaintance with the subject, because of my connection with the Peabody and the Slater Education Funds, I'm sure the volume has such a strong claim upon the people that no commendation is needed. The life of Booker T. Washington cannot be written. Incidents of birth, parentage, schooling, early struggles, later triumphs may be detailed with accuracy, but the life has been so incorporated, transfused into such a multitude of other lives, broadening views, exalting ideals, molding character, that no human being can know its deep and beneficent influence, and no pen can describe it. Few living Americans have made a deeper impression on public opinion, softened or removed so many prejudices, or awakened greater hopefulness in relation to the solution of a problem, encompassed with 1,000 difficulties and perplexing the minds of philanthropists and statesmen. His personality is unique. His work has been exceptional. His circle of friends has constantly widened. His race, through his utterances and labors, has felt an upward tendency, and he himself has been an example of what worth and energy can accomplish, and a stimulus to every one of both races, aspiring to a better life and to doing good for others. It has been said with truth that the race problem requires the patient and wise cooperation of the North and the South, of the white people and the Negroes. It is encouraging to see how one true, wise, prudent, courageous man can contribute far more than many men to the comprehension and settlement of questions which perplex the highest capabilities. Great eras have often revolved around an individual. And so, in this country, it is singular that, contrary to what pessimists have predicted, a colored man, born a slave, freed by the results of the war, is accomplishing so much toward thorough pacification and good citizenship, while Mr. Washington has achieved wonders in his own recognition as a leader and by his thoughtful addresses. His largest work has been the founding and the building up of the Normal and Industrial Institute at Tuskegee, Alabama. That institution illustrates what can be accomplished under the supervision, control, and teaching of the colored people, and it stands conspicuous for industrial training, for intelligent, productive labor, for increased usefulness in agriculture and mechanics, for self-respect and self-support, and for the purification of home life. A late circular of the trustees of Hampton Institute makes the startling statement that 6 millions of our Negroes are now living in one-room cabins. Under such conditions, morality and progress are impossible. If the estimate be approximately correct, it enforces the wisdom of Mr. Washington in his earnest crusade against the one-room cabin, and is an honorable tribute to the revolution wrought through his students in the communities where they have settled. Every student at Tuskegee, in the proportion of the impression produced by the principal, because a better husband, becomes a better husband, a better wife, a better citizen, a better man or woman. A series of useful books on the great educators has been published in England and the United States, while Washington cannot, in learning and philosophy, be ranked with Herbert, Pestalozzi, Froebel, Hopkins, Wayland, Harris. He may be truly classed among those who have wrought grandest results on mind and character. J. L. M. Curry, Washington, D.C., November 16th, 1899. All right, let's go past the table of contents and get to chapter 1. It's getting there. We're almost there. Chapter 1, Birth and Early Childhood. Many requests have been made of me to write something of the story of my life. Until recently, I have never given much consideration to these requests, for the reason that I have never thought that I had done enough in the world to warrant anything in the way of an autobiography. And I hope that my life work, by reason of my present age, lies more in the future than in the past. My daughter, Portia, said to me not long ago, "Papa, do you know that you have never told me much about your early life, and your children want to know more about you?" Then it came upon me as never before that I ought to put something about my life in writing for the sake of my family, if for no other reason. I will not trouble those who read these lines with any lengthy historical research concerning my ancestry, for I know nothing of my ancestry beyond my mother. My mother was a slave on a plantation near Hell's Ford in Franklin County, Virginia, and she was, as I now remember it, the cook for her owners as well as for a large part of the slaves on the plantation. The first time that I got a knowledge of the fact that my mother and I were slaves was by being awakened by my mother early one morning, while I was sleeping in a bed of rags on a clay floor of our little cabin. She was kneeling over me, fervently praying, as was her custom to do, that someday she and her children might be free. The name of my mother was Jane. She, to me, will always remain the noblest embodiment of womanhood with whom I have come in contact. She was wholly ignorant as far as books were concerned, and, I presume, never had a book in her hands for 2 minutes at a time. But the lessons in virtue and thrift which she instilled in me during the short period of my life that she lived will never leave me. Some people blame the Negro for not being more honest, as judged by the Anglo-Saxon standard of honesty. But I can recall many times when, after all was dark and still, in the late hours of the night, When her children had been without sufficient food during the day, my mother would awaken us, and we would find that she had gotten from somewhere something in the way of eggs or chickens, and had cooked them during the night for us. These eggs and chicken were gotten without my master's permission or knowledge, perhaps by some code of ethics. This would be classed as stealing, but deep down in my heart, I can never decide that my mother, under such circumstances, was guilty of theft. Had she acted thus as a free woman, she would have been a thief, but not so, in my opinion, as a slave. After our freedom, no one was stricter than my mother in teaching and observing the highest rules of integrity. Who my father was, or is, I have never been able to learn with any degree of certainty. I only know that he was a white man, as nearly as I can get at the facts. I was born in the year 1858 or 1859. At the time I came into the world, no careful registry of births of people of my complexion was kept. My birthplace was near Hales Ford in Franklin County, Virginia. It was about as near to nowhere as any locality gets to be, so far as I can learn. Hales Ford, I think, was a town with one house and a post office, and my birthplace was on a large plantation several miles distant from it. I remember very distinctly the appearance of the cabin in which I was born and lived until freedom came. It was a small log cabin about 12 by 16 feet and without windows. There was no floor except a dirt one. There was a large opening in the center of the floor where sweet potatoes were kept for my master's family during the winter. In this cabin, my mother did the cooking, the greater part of the time, for my master's family. Our bed, or pallet, as we called it, was made every night on the dirt floor. Our bed clothing consisted of a few rags gathered here and there. One thing I remember more vividly than any other in connection with the days when I was a slave was my dress, or rather, my lack of dress. The years that the war was in progress between the states were especially trying to the slaves, so far as clothing was concerned. The Southern white people found it extremely hard to get clothing for themselves during that war. And, of course, the slaves underwent no little suffering in this respect. The only garment that I remember receiving from my owners during the war was a tow shirt. When I did not wear this shirt, I was positively without garment. In Virginia, the tow shirt was quite an institution during slavery. This shirt was made of the refuse flax that grew in that part of Virginia, and it was a veritable instrument of torture. It was stiff and coarse until it had been worn for about 6 weeks. It made one feel as if 1,000 needle points were pricking his flesh. I suppose I was about 6 years old when I was given one of these shirts to wear. After repeated trials, the torture was more than my childish flesh could endure, and I gave it up in despair. To this day, the sight of a new shirt revives the recollection of the tortures of my first new shirt. In the midst of my despair, in connection with this garment, my brother John, who was about 2 years older than I, did me a kindness which I shall never forget. He volunteered to wear my new shirt for me until it was broken in. After he had worn it for several weeks, I ventured to wear it myself, but not without pain. Soon after my shirt experience, when the winter had grown quite cold, I received my first pair of shoes. These shoes had wooden bottoms, and the tops consisted of a coarse kind of leather covering, and I have never felt so proud since of a pair of shoes. As soon as I was old enough to perform what, to me, was important service in holding the horses and riding behind the white women of the household on their long horseback rides, which were very common in those days. At one time, while holding the horses and assisting quite a party of visiting ladies to mount their horses, I remember that. Just before the visitors rode away, a tempting plate of ginger cakes was brought out and handed around to the visitors. This, I think, was the first time that I had ever seen any ginger cakes, and a very deep impression was made upon my childish mind. I remember I said to myself that if I could ever get to the point where I could eat ginger cakes as I saw those ladies eating them, the height of my ambition would be reached. When I grew to be still larger and stronger, the duty of going to the mill was entrusted to me. That is, a large sack containing 3 or 4 bushels of corn was thrown across the back of a horse, and I would ride away to the mill, which was often 3 or 4 miles distant, wait at the mill until the corn was turned into meal, and then bring it home. More than once, while performing this service, the corn or meal got unevenly balanced on the back of the horse and fell off into the road, carrying me with it. This left me in a very awkward and unfortunate position. I, of course, was unable, with my small strength, to lift the corn or meal up on the horse's back, and therefore I would have to wait, often for hours, until someone happened to be passing along the road strong enough to replace the burden for me. My owner's name was Jones Burroughs, and I am quite sure he was above the average in the treatment of his slaves. That is, except in a few cases, they were not cruelly whipped. Although I was born a slave, I was too young to experience much of its hardships. The thing in connection with slavery that has left the deepest impression on me was the instance of seeing a grown man, my uncle, tied to a tree early one morning, stripped naked, and someone whipping him with a cowhide. As each blow touched his back, the cry, "Pray, master! Pray, master!" came from his lips, and made an impression upon my boyish heart that I shall carry with me to my grave. When I was still quite a child, I could hear the slaves in our quarters whispering in subdued tones that something unusual, the war, was about to take place, and that it meant their freedom. These whispered conferences continued, especially at night, until the war actually began. While there was not a single slave on our plantation that could read a line, in some way we were kept informed of the progress of the war, almost as accurately as the most intelligent person. The grapevine telegraph was in constant use. When Lee surrendered, all of the plantation people knew it, although all of them acted as if they were in ignorance of the fact that anything unusual had taken place. Early one morning, just after the close of the war, word was sent around to the slave cabins that all the slaves must go to the big house, the master's house, and in company with my mother and a large number of other slaves, including my sister Amanda and brother John, I went to the big house and stood by the side of my mother and listened to the reading of some papers and a little speech made by the one who read the papers. This was the first public address I had ever heard, and I need not add that it was the most effective one to which it had ever been my privilege to listen. After the reading of the paper and the speech, my mother leaned over and whispered, "Now, my children, we are free." This act was hailed with joy by all the slaves, but it threw a tremendous responsibility upon my mother, as well as upon the other slaves. A large portion of the former slaves hired themselves to their owners, while others sought new employment. But before the beginning of the new life, most of the ex-slaves left the plantation for a few days at least, so as to get the hang of the new life and to be sure that they were free. My mother's husband, my stepfather, had in some way wandered into West Virginia during the war and had secured employment in the salt furnace near Malden in Kanawha country. Soon after freedom was declared, he sought out my mother and sent a wagon to bring her and her children to West Virginia. After many days of slow, tiresome traveling over the mountains, during which we suffered much, we finally reached Malden, and my mother and her husband were united after a long enforced separation. The trip from Franklin County to Malden, West Virginia, was the first one that had taken me out of the country where I was born. And, of course, it was quite an event, especially to the children of the family, although the parting from the old homestead was to my mother a very serious affair. All of our household and other goods were packed into a small wagon drawn by 2 horses or mules. I cannot recall how many days it took us to make this trip, but it seems to me, as I recall it now, that we were at least 10 days. Of course, we had to sleep in the wagon, or what was more often true, on the ground. The children walked a great portion of the distance. One night we camped near an abandoned log cabin, and my mother decided that instead of cooking our frugal meal in the open air, as she had been accustomed to do on this trip, she would build a fire in this cabin, and we should both cook and sleep in it during the night. When we had gotten the fire well started, to the consternation of all of us, a large and frightful looking snake came down the chimney. This, of course, did away with all idea of our sheltering ourselves in the cabin for the night, and we slept out in the open air, as we had done on previous occasions. Since I have grown to manhood, it has been my privilege to pass over much of the same road traveled on this first trip to West Virginia. But my recent journeys have been made in well-appointed steam cars. At the time I first traveled through that part of Virginia and West Virginia, there was no railroad. And if there had been, we did not have the money to pay our passage. At the close of the war, our family consisted of my mother, stepfather, my brother John, and sister Amanda. My brother John is director of the mechanical department of the Tuskegee Institute, and my sister, now Mrs. Amanda Johnson, lives in Malden, West Virginia. Soon after we moved to West Virginia, my mother took into our family, notwithstanding our own poverty, a young orphan boy who has always remained a part of our family. We gave him the name of James B. Washington. He, now grown to manhood, holds an important position at the Tuskegee Institute. While I have not had the privilege of returning to the old homestead in Franklin County, Virginia, since I left there as a child immediately after the war, I have kept in more or less correspondence with members of the Burroughs family, and they seem to take the deepest interest in the progress of our work at Tuskegee. And that concludes chapter 1. As you can see, we got here the house Booker T. Washington's family lived in West Virginia at the time he left for Hampton Institute. All right, looks like we got us looks like it might be a shotgun house here. Seen a lot of those while I was in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. The cabin in Old Virginia where Booker T. Washington lived when he was a small boy. Let's see, they got the clothing lines out there. All right, yeah, that ain't no joke right there. That roof looked like it's gone. Look like there might be a lot of dripping happening inside that house. This is how our ancient ancestors, this is how our ancestors came up in the new European society called the United States of America. So on our next episode, we'll be going into chapter 2, Boyhood in West Virginia. Oh man, you know, Booker T. Washington's story, his life story, is always been, as you can see, it's kind of hard to see it there. But we'll go to the main, one of the main pages to help that be a little more, look a little more. All right, there we go. Story of my life, my work. You know, I used to read this book to my grandmother. In her late 80s and 90s, she started to lose her eyesight, so she wasn't able to read anymore on her own. You know, so I would come over to her place and I would read. I would read Booker T. Washington's autobiography to her, and it always put a smile on her face. You know, this is one of the best memories that I have of Mama Ann. And some of my memories of Mama Ann go back to my childhood. So I always remember her making some stewed tomatoes and lima beans. So she would always do that. And then my dad, you know, he would take me out there to the country, go see Mama Ann, and then we do little work or whatever, might cut the grass, you know, help her with stuff. And Mama Ann always give me $5, $10, or something like that. You know, she always cook and spend, you know, we get to spend some time with Mama Ann. So sitting in this chair that I'm sitting in right now, it always gives me those feelings. And also looking at this book. Every time I look at this book, you know, I remember my grandmother. You know, my grandmother. This was my grandmother's book, and I'm pretty sure someone bought this book for her. You know, because she wasn't born when this book was published. You know, so this is history that is passed down from, you know, from generation to generation to generation. And I plan to make sure that I pass it down to my children and they pass it down to their grandchildren. And we hold on to this because this is an important piece of history. You know, what Booker T. Washington did down in Alabama, it's next level. Like, it's some superhero stuff. You went down into territory that was, you know, they didn't want nobody reading anything down there. You build a school and you get the students to build the school. I could only imagine the amount of danger that they was dealing with on a regular basis. The challenges that they was dealing with. They lived in the equivalent of tent cities until they built the standing structure. The students lived in tents, okay? Imagine sending your child to college, to university, and your child has to sleep in a tent every day. And your child's job is to help the main principal, the main headmaster, the dean, the president of the university. They got to help them to build the university because there's no university there. It's just a bunch of people. That's Tuskegee, right? That is the story of Tuskegee, okay? Right. And a big part of the story of Tuskegee is Hampton Institute, which we call Hampton University today. Right. This is where Booker T. Washington was educated. Right down the street from here. I'm in Newport News, Virginia, for anybody who doesn't know. All right. I'm probably about 10 to 15 miles away from Hampton University right now, which used to be called Hampton Institute. Okay. Used to work on the campus and everything. Right. So this book and this story means a lot to me. Okay. There's so many layers to why this story means so much to me. And I'm thankful to be able to read it for y'all. And I'm so thankful to, you know, to be able to read it to my children, you know, because the type of resilience that the students at Tuskegee University, that type of resilience that they have, that's almost impossible to find today in American children. Right. But my children will have it. And I hope that each one of you are out there reading this book because I hope that you want your children to have it. Okay. Because that resilience, that self-discipline, that ability, oh man, special. And it's all going to unfold as we keep reading the book, because we got quite a few chapters to go in Booker T. Washington's autobiography. But you're going to see some real nuggets, you know, to give to your family, to give to your children, and improve, you know, whatever parts of your life that you want to improve, because every piece of that is all through this book, you know. So I could talk forever about this because I'm excited about reading this book. But I'm going to go ahead and jump off. And I'll catch y'all in episode 120, where we go into chapter 2 Booker T. Washington's boyhood years. All right. And until then, y'all be blessed and expose your gift.